Our phones are now the centre of our lives. They track our every move, our every call.
Police emergency.
And for police, they have become the key to solving crimes. This series is about the unique calls that cracked open Australia's most shocking murder cases.
It's taking a sinister turn.
Voices from beyond the grave.
He's got blood everywhere.
Calls you've never heard before.
I think he might have been shot.
The amazing stories of how today's telephone calls brought Australia's most horrific murderers to justice.
It's horrible.
Police emergency. Yeah, what's the emergency, sir?
It's my boss. There was a bang and I think he might have been shot.
This 000 call in South Australia began a massive hunt for a deranged killer, a murderer whose hate for his victim had reached boiling point.
He had a list. Margaret's name happened to be at the top.
Tonight, the cold-blooded murder of Dr Margaret Tobin, a woman who championed the rights of the mentally ill.
You start to look at it being some sort of assassination, I suppose.
Gunned down by a vengeful enemy.
When she died, everybody lost.
With no direct witnesses to the brutal slaying, it was a series of phone calls that cracked open the case.
Well, I saw the picture in the paper, and I thought, yes, I know that bugger. He stayed at my motel.
October 14, 2002. 400 people were working in the city centre building in Adelaide. In the lift that afternoon were 3 people and Dr Margaret Tobin. 2 of them exited on level 7, and Margaret's journey to the next floor was her last.
Police emergency. What's the emergency, sir?
It's my boss, Dr Tobin. There was a bang and she just collapsed.
There was a bang?
I don't know, I think he might have been shot.
Dr Margaret Tobin, South Australia's Director of Mental Health, shot at close range as she stepped out of the lift.
She said, Margaret's been shot and they couldn't save her. I just kept thinking, maybe this is just not real. This is something you see on TV. It's not really happening and it can't be my sister. It can't be. She can't be dead. They tried to save her and they couldn't.
I first heard about the shooting from my boss of the time. I was in a cab. She called me to say, don't come into the building, Margaret's been shot. It had such a marked impact on everybody who knew her.
All we knew that a person had been shot, there'd been a number of shots fired. I wasn't sure where the shooter was or who the shooter was or how many were involved.
That building probably housed 300 or 400 people, many of whom were hiding behind desks, not knowing whether or not someone was running amok.
The priority was to lock down the building. Everyone inside was now either a witness or a potential suspect. And while every person and bag was checked, Mick Standing was on level 8, trying to form a picture of the brazen killer.
Well, the fact that he fired 4 rounds told me that whoever done this shooting was determined to kill the person. You don't fire 4 rounds in the hope that someone's going to. They really wanted to put Margaret Tobin down. We were certainly dealing with a person that knew how to use a handgun.
So given the identity of the person involved, the head of the mental health in South Australia, you start to look at it being some sort of assassination.
She's my first best friend and my soulmate. We sort of, it's a caring and loving relationship.
Margaret Tobin had been married to Don Scott for 13 years. The eldest of 8, she was a born leader.
She knew what she wanted to be when she grew up. From the word go, and she said, I want to be a doctor, and she did.
At the time she was gunned down, Dr Margaret Tobin was working tirelessly to improve the lives of the mentally ill. But while she was a breath of fresh air for many patients and their families, there were those who didn't like her challenging their old institutional ways.
Margaret was very passionate about her role and she took her job very seriously and she made enemies in her job. We know that. And a lot of people didn't agree with what she was doing.
Margaret got under the noses of a lot of people, so yeah, you were looking at the possibility of disgruntled clients, disgruntled employees, ex-employees. Who would know?
The police were at a loss. Not one person on the 8th floor where Margaret Tobin had been shot could give any clue as to what the killer looked like.
It's frustrating the fact that no one saw anything. You think to yourself, gee, if that's the way this is going to run, we've got a difficult investigation.
Worse still, there were no electronic eyes in the building.
There's CCTV surrounding the building, CCTV in Rundle Mall, but the building itself, there's none, so certainly you can't get a good identification of what's happened in the area.
So police went back to those who were with Margaret on her fatal journey, hoping they'd remember something.
Think about how many times you've been in the lift and described the people in there you didn't know. No one takes any notice. You get in the lift, you go to where you're going, and that's it.
Fortunately, someone did remember the stranger in the lift.
His information then led to an Identikit photograph being produced.
Police want to speak to this man who travelled in the same elevator as Dr Tobin. It's possible the killer was a professional hitman.
The bearded assassin had also been seen earlier that day by Margaret's good friend.
I remember quite starkly going to get my coffee and it was drizzling with rain. And I got into the lift and this chap got into the lift. He was standing next to me and I looked at him and we had eye contact and we actually made conversation about the weather because he had raindrops on his jacket. And I was thinking he was a courier, you know, something like that, because his jacket was bulky. And then I got out on the 7th floor. In hindsight, it came to me that he followed me into the lift to actually ascertain whether I was Margaret. And clearly he was either casing the joint or he was stalking her.
The person who is responsible for the shooting, we don't know who he is. We do not have a suspect at this time.
All they had was an Identikit photo to go on.
I cannot tell you how the killer made his escape.
Where he was now was a mystery. And according to the hundreds of calls coming in from the public, he could be anybody and be anywhere.
There was a lot of information came in from the public. At that stage, we were following everything and anything with a hope of finding the shooter. And you always hope for that, for one crucial call that's going to turn the course of your investigation, and we got it. It came through.
I saw a person matching that Identikit, and I think he dropped a gun.
When the Identikit shot came up on the news, my immediate reaction was, that's the guy that I saw.
Bob Champion was working at the Brisbane Convention Centre 6 months before Margaret Tobin was shot.
On that morning, I slipped out of the conference room out onto the terrace between the hotel and the convention centre to have a cigarette. I heard a strange clattering noise on the ground behind me on the concrete, and I thought that sounded like a gun. So I spun around and had a look in that direction and locked eyes with a gentleman who was squatting down on the ground, tucking something back into the back of his trousers.
Bob was a sound engineer at the time and commented on the sound that object made, that it sounded like a gun falling onto the ground.
I'd recently just been working on a movie where there were a lot of guns involved, and I was listening to them being dropped on concrete on a regular basis. So it was a sound that was fairly in the fore of my mind anyway at that time.
The manic look of the man was also unforgettable.
He looked a bit wild. You see the whites of people's eyes and you get that impression they're either terrified or they're about to kill you or something. So my immediate reaction was, don't look at him anymore, turn around, which I did.
But the incident had happened 6 months before Margaret was shot and over 2,000 kilometres away from Adelaide.
The questions are, is this even related? Was Dr Tobin in Brisbane? And it just opens up a whole series of questions.
Exactly a week after her death, the much-loved and admired Margaret Tobin was given a state funeral. Many were there, including the police, and perhaps her killer.
The whole cathedral was surrounded by police outside and on the inside. It was necessary because they hadn't found who'd done it yet. But that took away that personal perspective of a family funeral. That's the part I found really hard.
In an often thankless role, she was making a difference for the most disadvantaged and alienated people in our community.
Getting others to see her vision was a constant battle. But she had always ploughed on.
She wasn't worried about getting people off site. She was just worried about doing a job and doing the right thing. Otherwise, she wouldn't have done it.
Dr Tobin was implementing some changes in the mental health system in South Australia. As a result of that, 2 brothers were nominated by Mental Health Services as being priority people for investigators to check. They'd been involved in some incidents at a mental health hospital. Their general description fitted the photo fit, and so that heightened the need to actively check that information. There was also the firebombing at a mental health institution, and there was a lot of hate mail that was delivered to mental health that revolved around Dr Tobin's changes.
We had to investigate all threats that had been made against Margaret Tobin. I don't think it numbered 100, but it was pretty close.
But by far the strongest lead they had was the phone call that alerted the detectives to the strange goings-on of a man in Brisbane. The bearded, long-haired man not only fitted the Identikit, but he had allegedly dropped a gun.
After the incident out there on the terrace, I reported it to the security at the convention centre. They went out through the back way and down, and they were able to get a glimpse of him getting into his car. They took notes and logged it down in their incident book.
Police also discovered that on the day this man was sighted at the convention centre, Margaret Tobin was a keynote speaker at the conference there.
Once I had the information that Margaret was at the conference, we had to identify the person who dropped the gun, because the possibility of it being the same person missed her in Queensland, come to Adelaide. It was a very strong possibility it was the same person. Once we had the registration number of the car that this weird person Bob had seen had run to, we established that that was a hire car. We established that it was hired in Sydney. We established the name of the person who'd hired it.
The car had been hired by a man by the name of Eric Gassy, who looked remarkably similar to the identikit of the man in the lift. When police did a background check on the 46-year-old, they found no criminal record. However, he did have a gun licence. But what really caught their attention was where he used to work.
His previous occupation came to light as a psychiatrist, and then his previous employment placements became known, and St George Hospital was one of those.
And Dr Margaret Tobin had also worked there at the exact same time.
We found that Dr Tobin and Gassy both applied for the same position at the St George Hospital, and Dr Tobin had won that position over him.
Gassy then, suffering from mental and physical stress, took time off work. But before he returned as a psychiatrist, dealing with vulnerable patients, Margaret Tobin asked the medical board for an assessment of his mental health.
As a result, Dr Gassy was diagnosed as being delusional, paranoid and out of touch with reality. And he was subsequently deregistered.
But Gassy's deregistration occurred 5 years before Margaret Tobin was shot.
The thought process is that there's a motive to kill Margaret Tobin, but that's a big grudge for someone to hold.
So the phone call about the man with the gun had proved to be the breakthrough they needed. But there was still a ton of work to be done to connect the deregistered Gassy to his ex-boss's cold-blooded murder.
We certainly didn't have anywhere near enough evidence to go to Sydney and arrest and charge him. We needed a lot more. And we had to prove he was in Adelaide for a start.
One of the first things detectives did was to see if Eric Gassy might have been following a pattern.
So we set out to do inquiries with hire car companies, and that was based on the use of the hire car in Brisbane.
Their hunch paid off. Gassy had hired a car near to his home in Sydney.
And the kilometres that that car travelled matched with the kilometres that you would travel from Sydney to Adelaide and return. But on its own, that doesn't prove anything at all. The person using the vehicle could come up with a number of explanations as to the distance. So detectives were sent on the two main routes between Adelaide and Sydney. They went to all of the motels, hotels in between, trying to identify a place that Gassy may have stayed at and trying to identify records or any CCTV footage that would be of assistance.
At the same time, with the help of their New South Wales colleagues, the South Australian detectives were granted a search warrant to look for any evidence at Eric Gassy's house.
Mr Gassy, we're here for the purpose of executing a search warrant, which I will shortly show you.
Dr Gassy lived at home with his parents. He had a self-contained unit in the ground floor of a two-storey house. His unit inside that house was quite messy. Gassy was present during that search, and he remained calm, didn't appear nervous at all.
Interestingly, he was clean-shaven.
I just thought that he was going out of his way to be too cool, too calm. That's what I thought, because the police come to your house and they say, we believe you've committed a murder, we're going to search, and you stand there with your arms folded and say nothing. Not a normal reaction.
Perhaps it was because Eric Gassy knew about the phone records.
During the course of the investigation, one of the things naturally you do is we looked at his phone records.
And there was a call on the record coming from the premises on the night of the murder.
At 7:33 on that night, an 18-second call was made from the phone in Gassy's house.
The only person at home or that had been at home during that period was Dr Gassy. His parents were overseas.
If the deregistered doctor had been home and made the call at that very time, then he couldn't have shot Margaret Tobin.
If we couldn't prove he was in Adelaide, we couldn't charge him with murder.
There was certainly a lot of material in there to go through. There was a safe found inside, and that safe was opened, and there was 2 Glock pistols located.
The Glock 26.
Ammunition and gun parts.
Is there any other weapons that are in this room, Mr Gassy?
Weapons?
As in firearms?
No.
But it was the disturbing material Gassy had filmed on his video camera that provided detectives with more ammunition.
A number of videos that you've had here, which we started to look at some of them. We believe they're of relevance, so we've seized them all.
The footage showed the paranoid and deregistered psychiatrist firing his Glock pistol at a target only a few metres in front of him.
An assumption you could make is that he's looking at the way he's shooting. He's trying to see if there's any faults in his method. There's not too many other reasons to take that sort of footage that you could think of.
In fact, the videos showed Gassy's aim continued to improve and he became a deadly shot.
The evidence that we were gathering showed that he was developing his skills to follow people, to get close to them and to shoot.
Detectives also found something else in Gassy's flat, a calendar. Circled were the exact dates of the conference Margaret Tobin was at in Brisbane.
He obviously was looking at opportunity. He'd gone to that Brisbane Convention Centre 6 months earlier and had what was as good as a failed attempt there. But what was found was still only some supporting evidence.
For Margaret's family, the wait was agonising.
I remember Mick telling us about, how they'd found a suspect of interest, but at this stage we can't arrest him because we don't have enough evidence. So that was frustrating because you think, well, if he's a suspect, why can't you, bring him in and do this and do that?
Would that be off the Glock?
Yeah.
Police were doing all they could to nail Gassy. But the Glocks found in his house couldn't be directly linked to the murder because Gassy had polished parts of the gun that destroyed any chance of comparison to the shell casings found at the crime scene. And his alibi about making a call in Sydney on the same day Margaret Tobin was shot dead in Adelaide couldn't be disproved.
We couldn't come up with an explanation as to how the call was made, or in fact if it was made.
Then a breakthrough. The team checking motels from Sydney to Adelaide called with incredible news.
Hey Nick, yeah, we're in a place called Balranald, and this motel owner here reckons she remembers a bloke from a couple of weeks ago.
Balranald is a tiny town in New South Wales, 850 kilometres from Sydney and a further 5 hours drive away from Adelaide.
A couple of the boys got to a little place called Balranald. They went to a place called the Shamrock Motel and they struck gold.
The owner of the motel remembered a guest who arrived late one afternoon.
When he booked into the motel, the owner was suspicious of the way he looked. His general appearance was a bit dishevelled, thick black hair, beard, sweating quite heavily. The owner was concerned about him, so she gave him an older room, number 17, in case he trashed it. She was certainly suspicious of him and his demeanour and his behaviour, that's for sure. And that's why he stuck in her mind.
He signed the register as David Pays.
We had to establish who this David Pays was. There was 2 or 3 people, but they weren't in the country. They weren't even in Australia at the time of the murder.
When the owner of the motel was shown a photo lineup, there was no doubt who it was.
It was obvious that the person who signed himself as David Pace was not David Pace, and in fact it was Eric Gassy.
That was the afternoon of the 12th of October, 2 days before Margaret Tobin was murdered. But again, it wasn't enough to make an arrest.
Yeah, so look, we're going to stay here tonight and we'll push on towards Adelaide tomorrow and see how we go.
All we've got is a fellow called Eric Gassy, who was at a convention in Brisbane where Margaret Tobin was, and a Balranald a couple of days before a murder. Coincidence? Well, you know, please yourself what you think, but I know what we thought, but we had to get him in Adelaide, and that was the next step, was to prove he was in Adelaide.
It was essential. What the detectives had also discovered at his house was troubling.
During the search of his unit, there was a number of papers located, or in fact a folio of papers located.
There's two items with some cut-out pictures from what could have been magazines or whatever, and there's some handwriting.
Amongst those was a list of psychiatrists. They were on sheets of paper with pictures and handwritten notes.
All of those featured were involved in one way or the other with Gassy's deregistration.
Is that your handwriting on those documents?
Looks like it, yeah, it is.
Gassy had a list. Margaret's name happened to be at the top, and there were a number of individuals on the list who he thought were responsible for what had happened, which was a frightening thought.
It did add extra concern to the investigation. We were definitely worried that others would be at risk when that list was found.
In the small country town of Renmark, 300 kilometres away from Adelaide, one of the residents who had been following the investigation on TV suddenly found himself part of the puzzle.
We watched our news and heard about this incident in Adelaide. There'd been a murder, it had happened in a government building, and it was a bit of a shock.
Brenton was the owner of the local petrol station. His was one of hundreds whose footage had been obtained by police on their road trip.
They told me at the time they were looking for evidence of this guy that had committed this murder in Adelaide. It may be just that he got fuel at the service station, so that was fine. I gave him 2 weeks' worth of tapes.
Amongst the hundreds of hours of CCTV footage, it was 10 minutes of that found at Brenton's station that roused the detectives' interest, and they were on the phone straight away.
Our phone rang very early in the morning, before 7 o'clock it was in fact, and it was a police officer from Adelaide, and he informed me that the guy they were looking for was on the tapes. So he wanted to come up and talk to me about it.
When Brenton was shown the tape, the day came flooding back to him.
I was behind the counter, so I was serving. And I remember the incident quite well because we had a lot of problems with shoplifters. So I was watching him while trying to serve this other customer. He went over to the fridge and he selected a bottle of water eventually, and he came back and came up behind this gentleman, and he paid with cash and he paid for his fuel and paid for his bottle of water, and I noticed that he actually looked up at the camera that was there behind me.
The date stamp was the 15th of October, the day after Margaret Tobin had been shot.
And then he moved away and then left the service station and went back to his car. And he was basically cleaning his car out. So he cleaned his car out and put it into a bag and put it into one of our rubbish bins. The policeman turned and looked me straight in the eye, quite close, and said, "We want that rubbish."
Could Gassy have been the bearded murderer in Adelaide on the day before? And was he dumping valuable evidence that could link him directly to her murder?
I remember Mick saying that we're really close now, so just hang in there, we're pretty sure we've got him. So it was quite a chilling moment for us, thinking, yes, finally they're going to catch him.
What we need to know is where this person stayed in South Australia on the night of Sunday the 13th of October this year.
Police say the man had a beard and long black hair. He may have since changed his appearance.
It's highly likely they used a name similar to Pais. It's P-A-I-S.
And probably within an hour or so of that a media release going out, the manager from the Lindy Lodge Motel rang in stating he had information that could assist.
Reading the advertiser, I saw this Identikit picture of a man. I put my hand over the lower part of his face and just looked at his nose and eyes type. And I thought, yes, I know that bugger. He stayed at my motel.
He provided information that a person of a similar description, using the name of Pace, had stayed at his motel.
Chap booked in probably 3 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and that's the last I saw of him until he left in the morning, probably about 8 or 9 o'clock, thereabouts.
The person involved, he's booked in prior to the murder at the Lindy Lodge, and he's got long hair and looking dishevelled.
And then in the afternoon he returned and asked me where he could get a haircut.
And he's gone and crossed to the shopping centre, had his hair cut and his beard shaved.
And when he came back, he was completely clean-shaven and quite short hair. And I mentioned this to him. I said, well, that's a change. And he made no comment at all. He left the following morning.
The information provided by the manager at the Lindy Lodge satisfied the investigators that there was a reasonable cause to suspect Gassy was the person responsible for the murder of Dr Tobin. And given the information in relation to the issues in Sydney with the other psychiatrists and the fact that he was now placed in South Australia at the time of the murder, that was a catalyst for a warrant being applied for his arrest.
With Gassy living in New South Wales, the detectives prepared to get him extradited. But the case wasn't over.
This investigation didn't have an eyewitness. There wasn't any person that did or could come forward that said they saw Gassy shoot Dr Tobin. So the investigation itself was a classic circumstantial case.
Now police were leaving no stone unturned to ensure the man who had taken away Don's soulmate would be locked away for good.
This person of interest.
2 critical calls from the public had got the detectives to where they were now.
The crucial call we got, really, in my mind, was the one from Queensland. That was the beginning of the end.
I saw a person matching that Identikit, and I think he dropped a gun.
The first call had led detectives to identify Gassy.
Because that was the call that I believe really put us on the right track.
The second call placed the identified Gassy in Adelaide on the day Margaret Tobin was killed.
Reading the advertiser, I saw this Identikit picture of a man, and I thought, yes, I know that bugger. He stayed at my motel.
Now, with Gassy arrested, they wanted to find the last remaining pieces of evidence that Gassy may have discarded at the local petrol station in Renmark.
The bag that was thrown out appeared to be something similar to a small white shopping bag, and the thoughts certainly turned to firearms being in that bag.
So, at a stinking rubbish tip and temperatures reaching 40 degrees, they steeled themselves to search for the plastic bag that could lock up Gassy for a very long time.
We were faced with a large wall of rubbish. Just looking at it, you started to think, well, how are we ever going to be able to identify where this material is? We're looking for one small shopping bag.
After 2 days of wading through tons of putrid garbage, they had found nothing.
I got a phone call saying, well, we can't find it, can you come out and help? And within a very short time, we found a bag, and I remember saying to the police officer, this is one of those bags from our service station. We tore it open a little bit, and it had dockets in it from the service station.
While there weren't any gun parts, what was in the white shopping bag was as good as a smoking gun.
The 2 main items that were located were 2 receipts. The first receipt had the name of the business that was involved torn out, but it still had room 17 written on it, and we were able to establish that that was the receipt from the Shamrock Motel. The second receipt was from the Edmundston Motel in Queensland, and that matched with the date of the incident at the Brisbane Convention Centre, some 6 months earlier.
While Gassy had used another alias, his intention to kill Margaret Tobin was the same.
Margaret Tobin was Eric Gassy's focus. He went to Brisbane in an effort to shoot her up there. He knew she was going to be there. The attempt failed, his gun fell out of his trousers and he botched it. Unfortunately, didn't make the same errors here in Adelaide.
While it had taken Gassy 5 years to research and plan his murderous revenge on Dr Margaret Tobin, it took a jury just over a day and a half of deliberation to find him guilty of her murder. For Don Scott, who has recently died, it was an absolute relief.
It was Margaret's birthday today. Good outcome.
Absolutely amazing. The fact that the whole case was based on circumstantial evidence, I think it was just really amazing. He prepared and he watched and he stalked her and he planned, and if the detectives hadn't been so thorough, he may have got away with it. He could be still walking the streets today.
For murdering the woman who had devoted her career to caring for the mentally ill, Gassy was given a life sentence. He is eligible for parole in 2032.
I don't think I'd be alone in saying I'd never want him to be on the streets. Gassy is a dangerous, nasty individual.
Margaret Tobin's death was a huge loss to everyone in South Australia. She was here to reform the whole mental health system in South Australia. So when she died, everybody lost. Everyone in South Australia lost.
I was very proud of Margaret, what she did, having her as my big sister. And I've lost someone who can't be replaced. I'm very grateful that he has been punished for what he did. And I hope he never gets out.